Welcome to the GridReady informational webinar, our second in the two-part sessions. I'm Nina Axelson. I'm the president and founder of Grid Catalyst. We'll talk a little bit more about our organization here in a moment, but just assuring you if that you're in the right place if you're here to talk about startup opportunities and collaborations with pilots here in Minnesota through our GridReady program. A short overview of our time together today. I'm going to walk through some background slides on our program, um, what Grid Catalyst does, and our experience in working through pilots and working with utilities, the structure of the program, and some information about the application and what we're going to be looking for in competitive applicants. And then I will stop the recording, which is active right now, and we'll move into the Q&A session. So usually about a 15-minute presentation, so not long to wait with your questions. If you want to drop something in the chat, that's perfectly fine. In general, I won't check the chat until we've moved into the Q&A. But if you want to make sure you don't lose your question or you want to put yourself into the queue, you're welcome to put something in the chat. Otherwise, you'll have the opportunity to come off mute. And you're welcome to come on camera and share your questions. As a just to reaffirm, we will turn off the recording for that component of things in case you have any concerns about sharing information that would be recorded and distributed. That is how we'll structure our time together. So I'm going to get going with our presentation. So about Grid Catalyst, we are 5 years into serving the startup community. We are based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. My background is in the utility sector. I worked in the district heating and cooling. Seeing a little lag, but I'm going to hope that it's does okay. But someone drop a note in the chat if I freeze up entirely. In the district heating, cooling, cogen, kind of utility infrastructure side of utility energy systems, that's actually part of the reason you see solar thermal over my shoulder here, integrated into a district system. We started serving the startup community in 2021 and with a very specific focus with helping startups bridge the commercialization valley of death with pilot projects. In our first series of cohorts where we were providing those pilot opportunities, we were matching startups at TRL 6 and above with partners in Minnesota who are all really committed to being early adopters. And so names that may be familiar to you would be an Xcel Energy or Great River Energy, Minnesota Power, and Otter Tail, who are our core anchors for this cycle of the program, but also 3M, Anderson Windows, Cummins, and other large partners that we have here. So really an opportunity for startups to work across sectors, verticals, applications, use cases, et cetera. So the short is we love working with startups and helping at this stage of proving out that your technology works so you can get to your next stage of commercialization and advancement. So in the work that we've done, we've deployed 16 pilot projects across Minnesota. Something that comes up all the time is, does my company need to be in Minnesota? And that is not a requirement of any of our programs. But we like to bring the projects here, especially because we do have those early adopters in our region. And it's a great opportunity to get connected to leading partners in the energy industry. And also, if your tech is going to be having an advantage from testing in cold climate, we have that available for folks to really show that you can pass the rigor of our climate zones. So you can see in these samplings of projects that we've worked on a variety of things from software, EV charging, heat pumps, batteries, really have kind of worked at data center cooling. So lots of different types of applications within those pilot deployments. And then, in my time working 13 years in the utility sector, also worked on emerging technology deployment and construction. So what is GridReady? So as much as we have really liked working across a wide range of sectors, we were presented with an opportunity from the leading partners that we have anchored for GridReady to say, what would it look like if we really tried to get a little bit more specific, so we could really curate or customize the programming that we do to fit the needs for the energy transition as it related to what utilities are prioritizing. So we built this program specifically around the needs identified by those anchor utilities that we're working with, and We also recognize, having just completed a utility innovation study last year, funded by the National Lab of the Rockies and the IN2 initiative, that we know this is a tough space, right? Utilities have a lot of very specific priorities around reliability, resilience, safety, cost effectiveness, and affordability. And it's important when we look at the pathways for emerging tech that we're considering those utility operations and economic priorities. And so we wanted to make sure that we're not only recruiting for the right technologies, but there we're really customizing the process of bringing you in to work with utilities and setting that up for success. And that's why we're so lucky to have the collaborators we do in this program. So, what are we offering here? Yeah, this just actually came up in a meeting earlier today, so we want to make sure we're being really clear about it. So, for the finalists who come through the program, they have an opportunity to pitch to the utilities, and then we will work as a facilitator between the utilities and the startups to map out an opportunity for a pilot with the expectation that those pilots would mobilize in 2027. There is funding to support. It's a pool of $80,000 that would be split amongst the finalists, including some travel support to come to Minnesota for our fall showcase, and then a little bit of extra funding to help just through the exploratory process with the utilities. The pilots themselves will be paid pilots, and that's obviously an important component of this. So we'll be making sure that we scope timelines and budgets that are appropriate for what the startups are going to need and what the utility expectations are and the funding that they have available for those projects. And as necessary, bringing other capital to the projects to make sure that they get completed. We have a lot of experience with bringing emerging technologies into these projects, so we'll be hand in hand with folks as we move through this process. And we really hope there's a value there to being able to work with a utility to understand what it looks like, not just to get that first pilot, but to actually scale. Like, we don't want anybody to end up in pilot purgatory where you're not able to go from one project to 100 projects or whatever your scaling goals are within this programming. So utility partners, we run the gamut here of looking at rural and urban, co-op and investor-owned utilities, starting with Great River Energy. I won't read through all of these, so they're there for you to learn more. And then Samantha from our team has also put the link to the website where you can learn more about the utilities and the program. But a not-for-profit wholesale electricity provider who's working with member-owned distribution co-ops across the state, which is really exciting because you have the opportunity to not only work with a larger regional partner, but also lots of localized or smaller cooperative partners, which we know are just great test partners. Minnesota Power, who is in northeastern Minnesota, if you're familiar with Lake Superior. If you're not, it's a great homework takeaway for you for the region that they're supporting, and very committed to energy innovation in addition to all the other goals we talked about previously. Xcel Energy is probably the larger of our utility partners here. So if some of you are coming from other states, Xcel might be active in your state. We also want to flag that Xcel has an open rolling RFI. If you're interested in just getting on their radar and talking to them in addition to applying to our program, I can drop that in the chat here later. And it's something that we always include in our newsletter. So kudos to Xcel for creating that front door process. And then Otter Tail Power Company, who is not just in Minnesota, but also North Dakota and South Dakota. So another great partner, and really across the full state of Minnesota. And like I said, a lot of different priorities, use cases, technical scenarios. So being able to get in front of all four of these utilities with the potential for feedback and ultimately a pilot project. So we sat down with all these utilities over the past few months prior to opening up the application and said, where is the common ground for priorities? We know there's a lot of different ways that folks are considering the opportunities within the energy transition, problems to solve, challenges to overcome. And again, upholding the priorities of reliability, security, safety, affordability, cost competitiveness, all these things that we know are important to the utilities. But also they're all really ambitious about making the system better. And that also comes across a lot of verticals. But in this case, we're focused on the grid modernization and grid enhancing technologies. electrification, and energy storage. One thing we want to note is we recognize there is an opportunity where you could be working on something that is electrification and energy storage, or something that's a grid enhancing technology that also overlaps with one of these other categories. And it is perfectly fine if your solution works across more than one vertical. In fact, that could actually be a benefit in that case. So um, don't don't think that that's something that's going to count against you. In fact, that would get you a higher score if you're working across more than one area of solutions. Technology maturity. So if you are already considering yourself at a TRL 7, that would qualify you into the program. If you are at a TRL 6 now, but your activities you have planned between now and December 1st would put you into a TRL 7, you would also be eligible for the program. In the application, you'll have an opportunity to talk about what you're doing in the form and in the your executive summary and pitch deck. So it's really important that if you check the box for TRL 6, you do a good job of explaining to us how you're going to reach that December 1st threshold, because that'll be really critical. Or even if you put yourself at a TRL 7, make sure that your description makes it very clear why you consider yourself a 7. If you're at a TRL 4 or 5, unfortunately, the application will encourage you to apply again in a future cycle. If you're on the webinar today and you're at a 4 or 5 and you're wondering about future opportunities, Samantha can put our program email address into the chat, and we can talk about where there would be other opportunities to partner, or we'd encourage you to sign up for our newsletter to look for future opportunities. So again, I won't read all of this information, but looking at our technology maturity, this is actually information that is directly from our applicant guide, which you can find on our website. Looking at what do we mean when we say TRL 6? What do we mean when we say TRL 7? So let's say you've developed a prototype and you've been putting it to work in the laboratory. If that's still not going to be quite mature enough for what we're looking here. But if it is if you're at a TRL 6 where it's in a near desired configuration and you've done some simulation in an appropriate environment or lab, so it's really gone through more of that testing rigor, then that gets you to the 6, and you'd have to show us how you're going to have a little bit more testing in an operational environment. Even if you're on a campus that's still within a campus, that's totally fine. But those are going to be the threshold things we're looking for and again, this is in our application guide. Another thing that we're trying to think about this year is the information that the Department of Energy published a couple of years ago, diversifying us from just the TRL threshold and thinking about adoption readiness levels. So going back to the how do we make sure you do a pilot and then you have opportunities to scale to the next appropriate milestone and adoption and readiness levels. Think about that in consideration of value proposition, resource maturity, licensing. Not noted here, but what are your financial resources or manufacturing capabilities? We don't ask a lot of questions about that in the form. There's just a few things that kind of nod to the ARL. But we like to include this slide because we really want to encourage all our startups to be looking at adoption readiness levels and making sure that you are considering that as you're looking for pilot opportunities, because that will really help whoever is looking at adopting it, not just utilities, know that you're really ready for this stage of growth. So how does this all come together? Excuse me, I'm just going to grab a little water. Applications are due June 26th, so we're just over 2 weeks out from that application. So make sure you've gone in and looked at the form and the requirements prior to June 26th, because we don't have a lot of ways to help you once the deadline has passed, unless you ran into an egregious issue with our platform on the submission day. But we're really hoping folks get those applications in as soon as possible. From the application deadline, our team internally reviews the applications and identifies a group of semifinalists. And then from the group of semifinalists, we have a third-party group of technical reviewers who are actually across the country with expertise in the various categories for this year, who will help us come up with a slate of finalists. The question came up in the last webinar, will you find out if you're a semifinalist? We don't send notifications to semifinalists because there's not actually anything in the process where you would provide more information between those two stages. However, if you're not selected as a finalist and you would like to talk to us and get feedback on how to strengthen your application or what to do next, we will be happy to meet with startups and talk through that feedback, and we can let you know if you made the semifinalist round. And then the finalist selection, it happens in mid-August. If you're selected for a finalist, we may ask you to do a short interview with us to make sure that we fully understood everything in your application and that there aren't any questions. And then we also, once you've been given finalist status, we'll offer to prepare you for the September showcase, which is scheduled for September 16th and 17th. And one of the things I always want to impress upon any of our startups is if you've spent a lot of the last 2 years pitching to investors and folks who are going to write checks for what you're doing, that's great. And I'm glad you've had that practice talking about your value proposition. But just a reminder that this is going to be a much more heavily technical presentation, right? We want to be able to convince the utilities that you have the rigor and the maturity around your technology, and that you have a clear vision of what a pilot would look like if you were to work together. So when you think about if you make that finalist stage, shifting into presenting at the showcase, there is really a pivot there from when you think about more of like an investor deck. The Fall Technology Showcase will be in person in Minnesota. We will provide travel funding to the presenter to come here to join us. If you have something already on your calendar, maybe a kid's recital or something else happening, and travel to Minnesota is just impossible for these dates, we will make hybrid accommodations, virtual presentation accommodations. But we'd really encourage that if you can make the trip here, it's really going to be worth your time because you're going to be able to be in the room with the utility partners, and then we will be hosting some reception opportunities where you'll be able to get to meet a lot of other energy industry partners and government officials here. So we're here to show you what the opportunity can look like in Minnesota, and that will be with those 4 utilities, but also there's a whole ecosystem of people here that we think would be valuable for you to meet. And as we noted, we'll cover those travel costs to make that convenient. And if you haven't been to Minnesota, I can promise you September is a pretty great time to be here. The weather is pretty wonderful. So on the other side of that, showcase in September, we move into our exploratory phase. We will ask all of our utility partners to identify any of the startups they're interested in continuing to speak with. We'll facilitate those meetings and conversations over the next few months. I'm just trying to be very transparent about the fact that we all know what happens in November and December with the holidays and travel and other things going on, that sometimes those conversations can really slow down. So we want to give you as much runway at the end of September and into October to make progress in those conversations, and then expect them to probably pick back up after the holidays. The goal at the end of that process is to get you aligned on the technology is a really good fit for the utility, and the pilot concept from scope, budget, timeline, outcomes really works for everybody at the table and will help with that process. And then with the expectation that pilots would be mobilized in 2027. For those who've looked at our previous programs, I want to note that there's a differentiation where our previous programs, pilots had 12 months to be completed. They usually would start by March of each year in each cycle, and we're expected to be completed by the following March. We don't have that same time constraint in the GridReady program. However, we want to make sure that expectations match up. So if you have a very specific deadline with a generation of your technology or what you're trying to accomplish, it's okay to come into the conversations to say it's really important to us that we mobilize by June of 2027. Or if, on the other hand, you're all talking about it and you want to do something bigger and it's a 2-year project, it's really about finding that alignment. And then our only caution to all parties is to make sure that the timeline doesn't get so long or so complicated that you're really setting it up to fail. because you can't manage those milestones and progress and momentum. So there's a sweet spot in there that will help find for the projects. And then we'll continue to make sure that those milestones are met. So Samantha was good enough to already put the Grid Ready link in the chat, so that's linkable for you. Otherwise, you can use the QR code here. In addition to the form, which is pretty straightforward with a few short answers under 200 words, there is also some multiple choice and very short answer components to the form, but shouldn't take very long. It's on the Jotform platform. But I think what tends to catch folks a little bit tougher on the deadline is they only expect to do the form and then they come into the deadline day and they forget that there are these attachments to it. Each of these attachments are intended to be something that, especially if you're already at a TRL7, you should have most of these materials in place. So, an executive summary about the technology, giving you just a little bit more space to write about what you're doing that the form doesn't accommodate. So, it can be 1 to 2 pages. Please don't submit anything longer than that because we'll only look at the first 1 to 2 pages. And then a PowerPoint presentation about, again, a little bit more space for you to storytell about what you're doing and your traction and your capabilities. And we all, of course, like visuals. If you have a standard investor pitch deck, even though I said don't bring that to the showcase, it is okay to include that in your application materials as long as it's not so focused on numbers, we don't get more information about your value proposition, about the technology, and what you're hoping to accomplish with GridReady. And then a 1 page or shorter summary of your team. So for the scoring rubric, um, we are, trying to make sure that we understand what you're bringing to the table and that you're a good fit for GridReady. And so our scoring rubric is really structured around that. And we'll be looking both internally and with our external reviewers at your pilot readiness, your technical maturity, your value proposition. We ask a few questions in the form about your financial resources, but that is not something that explicitly is looked at as a threshold thing for our decision making. And I think that's it for my slides. So I'm gonna stop recording. Came in even a little under than usual here.